And she had one, said Mr. Diggory. I found her holding one, Ludo. If it's all right with you, Mr. Crouch, I think we showed her one she got to save herself. Crouch gave no sign that he had heard Mr. Diggory, but Mr. Diggory seemed to take his silence for assent. He raised his own wand, pointed it at Winky, and said, Renevate. Winky stared feebly. Her great brown eyes opened and she blinked several times in a bemused sort of way. Watched by the silence wizard, she raised herself shakily into a sitting position. She caught sight of Mr. Diggory's feet and slowly, tremulously raised her eyes to stare up into his face. Then, more slowly still, she looked up into the sky. Harry could see the floating scar reflected twice in her enormous, glassy eyes. She gave a gasp, looked weakly around the crowd clearing, and burst into terrified sobs. Elf, said Mr. Diggory sternly, do you know who I am? I am a member of the Department of the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures. Winky began to rock backwards and forward on the ground, her breath coming in sharp bursts. Harry was reminded forcibly of Dobby in his moment of terrified disobedience. As you see, Elf, the dark mark was conjured here a short while ago, said Mr. Diggory, and you were discovered moments later, right beneath it. An explanation, if you please. I is not doing it, sir, Winky gasped. I is not knowing how, sir. You were found with a wand in your hand. Barked Mr. Diggory, brandishing it in front of her, and as the wand caught the green light that was filling the clearing from the skull above, Harry recognized it. Hey, it's mine, he said. Everyone in the clearing looked at him. Excuse me, said Mr. Diggory incredulously. That's my wand, said Harry. I dropped it. You dropped it, repeated Mr. Diggory in disbelief. Is this a confession? You threw it aside after you conjured the mark? Almost. Think who you talking to, said Mr. Weasley, very ugly. Is Harry Potter likely to conjure the dark mark? Of course not, mumbled Mr. Diggory. Sorry, carried away. I didn't drop it there anyway, said Garry, jacking his thumb towards the trees beneath the skull. I missed it right after we got into the wood. So, said Mr. Diggory, his eyes hardening as he turned to look at Winky again, cowering at his feet. You found this wand, yeah, Elf? And you picked it up and thought you have some fun with it, did you? I is not doing magic with it, sir, squealed Winky, tears streaming down the side of the squashed and bulbous nose. I just picked it up, sir. I is not making the dark marks. I is not knowing how. It wasn't her, said Hermione. She looked very nervous, speaking up in front of all this mystery wizard, yet determined all the same. Winky got a quickly little voice, and the voice we heard during the incitation was much deeper. She looked round at Harry and Ron, appealing for their support. It didn't sound anything like Winky did it. No, said Harry, shaking his head. It definitely didn't sound like an elf. Yeah, it's a human voice, said Ron.
Well, we'll soon see, growled Mr. Diggory, looking unimpressed. There's a simple way of discovering the last spell at one performed, Elf. Did you know that? Winky trembled and shook her head frantically, her ears flapping as Mr. Diggory raised his own wand again and placed it tips with Harry's. Prior incantato, roared Mr. Diggory. Harry heard Hermione gasp, horrified, as a gigantic serpent-tongued skull erupted from the point where the two wands met, but it was a mere shadow of the green skull high above them. It looked as though it was made of the grey smoke, the ghost of the spell. Delirious, Mr. Diggory shouted, and the smoky skull vanished in a wisp of smoke. So, said Mr. Diggory with a kind of savage triumph, looking down upon Winky, who was still shaking convulsively. I is not doing it, she squealed, her eyes rolling in terror. I is not knowing how. I is a good elf, I isn't using wands, I isn't knowing how. You been caught red-handed, elf, Mr. Diggory roared, caught with the guilty wand in your hand. Amos, said Mr. Weasley loudly, I think about it. Precious few wizards know how to do that spell. Where would she have learned it? Perhaps Amos is suggesting, said Mr. Crouch, cold anger in every syllable, that I routinely teach my servants to conjure the dark mark. There was a deeply unpleasant silence. Amos Diggory looked horrified. Mr. Crouch, not at all. You have now come very close to accusing the two people in this clearing who are least likely to conjure that mark, barked Mr. Crouch. Harry Potter and myself. I suppose you are familiar with the boys' stories, Amos. Of course, everyone knows, muttered Mr. Diggory, looking highly discomfited. And I trust you remember the many proofs I have given over a long career that I despise and detest the dark arts and those who practice them. Mr. Crouch shouted, his eyes bulging again. Mr. Crouch, I never suggested you had anything to do with it, muttered Amos Diggory, now reddenly behind the scrubby brown beard. If you accused my elf, you accused me, Diggory, shouted Mr. Crouch. Where else would she have learned to conjure it? She might have picked it up somewhere. Precisely, Amos, said Mr. Weasley. She might have picked it up anywhere. Winky, he said kindly, turning to the elf. But she flinched as though he, too, was shouting at her. Where exactly did you find Harry's wand? Winky was twisting the hem of her tea towel so violently that it was fraying beneath her fingers. I is finding it there, sir, she whispered. There in the trees, sir. You see, Amos, said Mr. Weasley, whoever conjured the mark could have disapparated right after they'd done it, leaving Harry's wand behind. A clever thing to do, not using their own wand, which could have betrayed them. And Winky here had the misfortune to come across the wand moments later and pick it up. But then she'd have been feet away from the real culprit, said Mr. Diggory impatiently. Elf, did you see anyone? Winky began to tremble worse than ever, her giant eyes flickering from Mr. Diggory to Ludo Bagman and on to Mr. Crouch. Then she gulped and said, I is seeing no one, sir, no one. Amos, said Mr. Crouch curly, I am fully aware that in the ordinary course of events, you would want to take Winky into your department for questioning. I ask you, however, to allow me to deal with her. Mr. Diggory looked as though he didn't think much of his suggestion at all, but it was clear to Harry that Mr. Crouch was such an important member of the ministry that he did not dare refuse him. You may rest assured that she will be punished, Mr. Crouch added coldly. Master, Winky stammered, looking up at Mr. Crouch, her eyes brimming with tears. Master, please. Mr. Crouch stared back, his face somehow sharpened, each line upon it more deeply etched. There was no pity in his gaze. Winky has behaved tonight in a manner I would not have believed possible, he said slowly. I told her to remain in the tent. I told her to stay there while I went to sort out the trouble. And I find that she disobeyed me. This means clothes. No, shrieked Winky, prostrating herself at Mr. Crouch's feet. No, master, no clothes, no clothes. Harry knew that the only way to turn a house elf free was to present it with the proper garments. It was pitiful to see the way Winky clutched at her tea towel as she sobbed over Mr. Crouch's feet. But she was frightened. Hermione burst out angrily, glaring at Mr. Crouch. Your elves scared of heights, and those wizards it must were levitating people. You can't blame her for wanting to get out in their way. Mr. Crouch took a step backwards, freeing himself from contact with the elf, whom he was surveying as though she was something filthy and rotten that was contaminating his overshined shoes. I have no use for a house elf who disobeys me, he said coldly, looking up at Hermione. I have no use for a servant who forgets what is due to her master and to her master's reputation. Winky was crying so hard that her sobs echoed around the clearing. There was a very nasty silence, which was ended by Mr. Weasley, who said quietly, Well, I think I'll take my lot back to the tent if nobody's got any objections. Amos, that once told us all it can. If Harry could have it back, please. Mr. Diggory handed Harry his wand and Harry pocketed it. Come on, you three, Mr. Weasley said quietly, but Hermione didn't seem to want to move. Her eyes were still upon the sobbing elf. Hermione, Mr. Weasley said more urgently. She turned and followed Harry and Ron out of the clearing and off through the trees. What's going to happen to Winky? Said Hermione the moment they had left the clearing. I don't know, said Mr. Weasley. The way they were treating her, said Hermione furiously. Mr. Diggory calling her elf all the time, and Mr. Crouch. He knows she didn't do it and that he is still going to sack her. He didn't care how frightened she'd been or how upset she was. It was like she wasn't even human. Well, that's not, said Ron. Hermione rounded on him. That doesn't mean she hasn't got feelings, Ron. It's disgusting the way.
Hermione, I agree with you, said Mr. Weasley quickly, beckoning her on. But now is not the time to discuss elf rights. I want to get back to the tent as fast as we can. What happened to the others? We lost them in the dark, said Ron. Dad, why was everyone so uptight about that skull thing? I'll explain everything back at the tent, said Mr. Weasley tensely. But when they reached the edge of the wood, their progress was impeded. A large crowd of frightened-looking witches and wizards was congregated there, and when they saw Mr. Weasley coming towards them, many of them surged forward. What's going on in there? Who conjured it? Arthur, it's not him. Of course it's not him, said Mr. Weasley impatiently. We don't know who it was. It looks like they disapparated. Now, excuse me, please. I want to get to bed. He led Harry, Ron, and Hermione through the crowd and back into the campsite. All was quiet now. There was no sign of the masked wizards, though several ruined tents were still smoking. Charlie's head was poking out of the boy's tent. "Dad, what's going on?" he called through the dark. "Fred, George, and Ginny got back okay, but the others—" "I've got them here," said Mr. Weasley, bending down and entering the tent. Harry, Ron, and Hermione entered after him. Bill was sitting at the small kitchen table, holding a bed sheet to his arm, which was bleeding profusely. Charlie had a large rip in his shirt, and Percy was sporting a bloody nose. Fred, George, and Ginny looked unhurt, though shaken. "Did you get them, Dad?" said Bill sharply. "The person who conjured the mark?" "No," said Mr. Weasley. "We found Barty Crouch's elf holding Harry's wand, but we are none the wiser about who actually conjured the mark." "What?" said Bill, Charlie, and Percy together. "Harry's wand?" said Fred. "Mr. Crouch's elf?" said Percy, sounding thunderstruck. With some assistance from Harry, Ron, and Hermione, Mr. Weasley explained what had happened in the wood. When they had finished their story, Percy swelled indignantly. "Well, Mr. Crouch is quite right to get rid of an elf like that," he said, running away when he'd expressly told her not to, embarrassing him in front of the whole ministry. How would they have looked if she'd been head up in front of the Department for the Regulation and Control? She didn't do anything. She was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Hermione snapped at Percy, who looked very taken aback. Hermione had always got on fairly well with Percy, better indeed than any of the others. "Hermione, a wizard in Mr. Crouch's position can't afford a house elf who's going to run amok with a wand," said Percy, pompously recovering himself. "She didn't run amok," shouted Hermione. "She just picked it up off the ground." "Look, can someone just explain what the skull thing was?" said Ron impatiently. "It wasn't hurting anyone. Why is it such a big deal?" "I told you, it's you-know-whose symbol, Ron," said Hermione before anyone else could answer. "I read about it in The Rise and Fall of the Dark Arts. And it hasn't been seen for 13 years, said Mr. Weasley quietly. Of course, people panicked. It was almost like seeing you-know-who back again. "I don't get it," said Ron, frowning. "I mean, it's still only a shape in the sky." "Ron, you-know-who and his followers sent the dark mark into the air whenever they killed," said Mr. Weasley. "The terror it inspired, you have no idea that you are too young. Just picture coming home and finding the dark mark hovering over your house and knowing what you are about to find inside." Mr. Weasley winced. Everybody worst fear, the very worst. There was silence for a moment. Then Bill, removing the sheet from his arm to check out his cut, said, "Well, it didn't help us tonight, whoever conjured it. It scared the Death Eaters away the moment they saw it. They all disapparated before we got near enough to unmask any of them. We got the Robertses before they hit the ground, though. They are having their memories modified right now." "Death Eaters?" said Harry. "What are Death Eaters?" "It's what you-know-whose supporters called themselves," said Bill. "I think we saw what's left of them tonight. The ones who managed to keep themselves out of Azkaban, anyway." "We can't prove it was them, Bill,"
said Mr. Weasley, though it probably was, he added hopelessly. Yeah, I bet it was, said Ron suddenly. Dad, we met Draco Malfoy at the woods, and he as good as told us his dad was one of those nutters in masks. And we all know the Malfoys were right in with you-know-who. But what were Voldemort's supporters? Harry began. Everybody flinched. Like most of the Wizards' world, the Weasleys always avoided saying Voldemort's name. Sorry, said Harry quickly. What were you-know-who's supporters up to, levitating muggles? I mean, what was the point? The point, said Mr. Weasley with a hollow laugh. Harry, that's their idea of fun. Half the muggle killings back when you-know-who was in power were done for fun. I suppose they had a few drinks tonight and couldn't resist reminding us all that lots of them are still at large. A nice little reunion for them, he finished disgustedly. But if they were the Death Eaters, why did they disappear when they saw the dark mark? Said Ron. They have been pleased to see it, wouldn't they? Use your brains, Ron, said Bill. If they really were Death Eaters, they worked really hard to keep out of Azkaban when you-know-who lost power and told all sorts of lies about him, forcing them to kill and torture people. I bet they've been even more frightened than the rest of us to see him come back. They denied they ever been involved with him when he lost his powers and went back to their daily lives. I don't reckon he'd be overpleased with them, do you? So, whoever conjured the dark mark, said Hermione slowly, were they doing it to show support for the Death Eaters or to scare them away? Your guess is as good as ours, Hermione, said Mr. Weasley, but I'll tell you this. It was only the Death Eaters who ever knew how to conjure it. I'd be very surprised if the person who did it hadn't been a Death Eater once, even as they know now. Listen, it's very late, and if your mother hears what's happened, she'll be worried sick. We'll get a few more hours sleep and then try and get an early port key out of here. Harry got back into his bunk with his head buzzing. He knew he ought to feel exhausted. It was nearly 3 in the morning, but he felt wide awake and worried. 3 days ago, it felt like much longer, but it had only been 3 days. He had awoken with his scar burning, and tonight, for the first time in 13 years, Lord Voldemort's mark had appeared in the sky. What did this thing mean? He thought of the letter he had written to Sirius before leaving Privet Dry. Would Sirius have got it yet? When would he reply? Harry lay looking up at the canvas, but no flying fantasies came to him now to ease him to sleep, and it was a long time after Charlie's snores filled the tent that Harry finally dozed off.